When I think about my childhood, it's not the laughter, warmth, or love that first comes to mind. Instead, it's the sound of the door slamming shut on a rainy October afternoon when I was 12. That's the last time I saw my father in our home. The day he left was the day everything changed for my mother and me. I remember sitting on the floor of my bedroom, drawing in a sketch pad, when I first heard the shouting. My parents argued sometimes, like all couples do, but this time felt different. The tension in their voices wasn't just anger, it was something heavier, sharper, and final. I crept to the top of the stairs, sitting quietly to eavesdrop, a habit I'd developed to understand the undercurrents of our family life. "I can't do this anymore, Karen," my father shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "I need to be happy, too. You can't expect me to stay in this miserable marriage forever." My mother's voice, usually calm and measured, broke with emotion. "Happy? You think running away is going to make you happy? What about Anna? What about our daughter? Are you just going to walk out on her?" There was a long pause before he responded, and in that moment, my stomach twisted into knots. "I'll visit. I'll help out financially. But I can't stay here. This isn't a life. This isn't living." I couldn't hold back a gasp, and my mother's tear-filled eyes glanced up at me. "Go to your room, Anna," she said sharply, her voice cracking. "Now." I bolted, tears already stinging my eyes. By the time I worked up the courage to sneak another glance, my father was gone. His side of the closet was empty, his favorite chair in the living room abandoned, and the car he always drove no longer parked in the driveway. The weeks that followed were a blur of change and confusion. My mother, despite her own heartbreak, did her best to shield me from the worst of it. But even as a child, I wasn't naive. I could see how much she struggled, working overtime to keep us afloat while juggling bills, groceries, and the responsibilities my father had left behind. At first, my father called occasionally, usually once a week. He'd ask about school, sports, and whether I'd finished reading the book he'd given me for my birthday. But his voice always sounded distracted, as if he wasn't really listening to my answers. I clung to those phone calls, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, even as they became less frequent. By the time I turned 13, they'd dwindled to once a month. By the time I turned 14, they'd stopped altogether. I tried to tell myself it wasn't his fault. Maybe he was busy with work. Maybe he was going through a tough time. But when I overheard my mother on the phone with a friend, I learned the truth: my father had remarried. He'd met someone new, a woman with 2 children of her own, and they were living together in a house across town. It was like a knife to the heart. He'd left us, not because he couldn't handle the pressure of family life, but because he wanted a different family, a better family. I threw myself into school and extracurricular activities, determined not to let his absence define me. But no matter how much I excelled academically or how many trophies I brought home from swim meets, there was always a part of me that wondered, did he even care? Did he ever think about me? My mother never badmouthed him, even when I knew she had every right to. She'd simply shrug and say, "He made his choice, Anna. Now we make ours." She was strong in a way I couldn't fully appreciate at the time. Despite her efforts to protect me, I couldn't avoid the reminders of his absence. Father-daughter dances at school, where I sat on the sidelines while my friends twirled in their father's arms. Parent-teacher conferences, where only one chair was ever filled. Holidays, where the empty seat at the table felt like a gaping wound. When I turned 16, I decided to reach out. I tracked down his new phone number through an old contact of his and called him on a sunny afternoon in June. I still remember the way my hands shook as I dialed. "Hello?" His voice was so familiar, yet so distant, it made my chest ache. "Hi, Dad. It's Anna." There was a long pause before he replied, "Anna. Wow, it's been a while. How are you?" The conversation was awkward and stilted. He asked generic questions about school and hobbies, as if I were a distant relative he barely knew. I tried to bridge the gap, telling him about my latest swim meet and how I'd been accepted into the honors program. But his responses were lukewarm at best, and by the time we hung up, I felt more alone than ever. That was the last time I tried. Over the years, I heard bits and pieces about his life from mutual acquaintances. He and his second wife seemed happy. Her children were successful and well-adjusted, often praised for their accomplishments at family gatherings I was no longer invited to. Meanwhile, my mother and I scraped by, celebrating small victories like paying off a bill early or finding a used car that didn't break down. By the time I turned 18, I'd built a wall around myself, determined not to let his absence define me. I graduated high school with honors, earned a scholarship to a prestigious university, and worked part-time jobs to help my mother with expenses. I built a life I was proud of, even if there was a small, empty space in my heart where a father's love should have been. I told myself I didn't need him. I had my mother, my friends, and eventually my own career and relationships. But deep down, I couldn't shake the lingering questions: why wasn't I enough? Why did he choose them over me? It wasn't until years later, when I was 34, that he came back into my life, bringing with him a storm of unresolved emotions and a secret that would change everything. But in those early years, all I knew was that he was gone and I had to learn how to live without him. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I had just returned from work, exhausted and halfway through reheating leftovers for dinner. My first instinct was to ignore it, assuming it was a telemarketer or another scam call, but something made me pause. On a whim, I picked up. "Hello?" I said cautiously, balancing the phone between my ear and shoulder. "Anna?" The voice on the other end was gravelly and hesitant, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. "Dad?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said, pausing as if to gauge my reaction. "It's me." I couldn't speak at first. It had been years since we'd last spoken, and the sound of his voice brought back a flood of memories, both painful and bittersweet. For a moment I was 12 years old again, sitting at the top of the stairs, listening to my parents argue. "What do you want?" I finally managed, my tone sharper than I intended. There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice wavered with something I couldn't quite place. I need your help, Anna. I don't have anyone else to turn to." My heart pounded in my chest as a mix of emotions surged through me: anger, confusion, and a faint, unwelcome twinge of concern. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Help with what?" "It's a long story," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "But I'm not in a good place right now. My health isn't great, and, well, things haven't been easy since Marjorie passed." Marjorie, his second wife. The woman he'd left us for. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth at the mention of her name. "And your stepkids?" I asked, unable to hide the edge in my voice. "The ones you chose over me? What about them?" He sighed heavily, the sound of it grating against my nerves. "They're busy with their own lives. They've drifted away. I can't rely on them anymore." I bit my lip, torn between wanting to hang up and wanting to hear him squirm. After everything he'd put me and my mother through, the audacity of his request was almost laughable. And yet, there was a small part of me, a part one wished I could ignore, that felt sorry for him. "Why now?" I asked. "Why are you calling me after all these years?" "Because I have no one else," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve it, Anna. I know I failed you. But I'm asking for your help, as a last resort." His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to tell him no, to remind him of all the times he'd ignored my calls, missed my birthdays, and chosen his new family over me. But instead I said, "I need to think about it." We hung up, and I spent the rest of the evening pacing my apartment, replaying the conversation in my head. Part of me wanted to let him rot in his own mess, but another part, the part that still longed for a father, felt compelled to help. The next day, I called my mother, hoping for guidance. She listened quietly as I recounted the call, her only response a low hum of acknowledgement. "What do you think I should do?" I asked, desperate for her advice. "It's not about what I think," she said after a long pause. "This is your decision, Anna, but whatever you choose, make sure it's something you can live with. Don't do it out of guilt, and don't let anger make the choice for you." Her words stuck with me. After days of deliberation, I finally called him back. "All right," I said, my voice steady. "You can come stay with me for a while, But this isn't permanent, and there will be ground rules." "Thank you," he said, his relief palpable. "Thank you, Anna. You don't know how much this means to me." I wanted to tell him that it didn't mean much at all, that I was doing this more for myself than for him, but I held my tongue. A week later, he arrived at my apartment with a single suitcase and a frail, tired look that made him seem much older than I remembered. His once broad shoulders were hunched, and the confident stride I'd associated with him had been replaced by a slow, tentative shuffle. "Hi, Dad," I said, forcing a smile as I opened the door. "Hi, Anna," he replied, his voice soft. He looked around the apartment, his gaze lingering on the photos on the walls, pictures of me and my friends, my college graduation, a vacation I'd taken with my mother. "This is nice," he said, nodding approvingly. "Thanks," I replied, unsure of what else to say. "Your room's down the hall. I cleared out some space in the closet for you." He nodded again and shuffled past me, his suitcase rolling behind him. I watched as he disappeared into the guest room, a strange mix of emotions churning inside me. Over the next few days, I tried to adjust to having him in my space. He was polite and quiet, almost too quiet, as if he were afraid of overstepping. He spent most of his time in his room, reading or watching TV, only emerging for meals or the occasional chat. But despite his low profile, I couldn't shake the tension in the air. Every interaction felt stilted, like we were both tiptoeing around an unspoken history. And then there were the little things that gnawed at me, the way he flinched when I asked about his health, the stack of unopened mail he kept in his room, the furtive phone calls he tried to hide. It wasn't long before I started to suspect that he wasn't telling me the whole truth about why he was here. And as much as I wanted to believe that his return was an opportunity for us to rebuild our relationship, a part of me couldn't help but wonder, was he really here for me? Or was there something else he wasn't saying? Those doubts lingered, growing louder with each passing day. And soon I would discover that my instincts were right. There was more to his story than I ever could have imagined. At first, my father's presence in my apartment was strange, but manageable. He was polite, almost overly so, making an effort to stay out of my way. He cleaned up after himself, offered to help with dinner, and kept his belongings neatly tucked away in the small guest room I had prepared for him. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But beneath that veneer of civility, something didn't feel right. It started with little things. He would receive phone calls late at night, whispering into the receiver as though he didn't want me to hear. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at a stack of letters on his nightstand, unopened and slightly crumpled, as if he'd been carrying them around for a while. When I asked about them, he'd dismiss my questions with a vague, "just some old paperwork." One evening, after a particularly awkward dinner, I decided to broach the topic directly. "Dad," I said, setting my fork down and leaning forward, "I can't help but notice that you seem distracted. Is everything okay?" He looked up at me, startled, and then quickly glanced away. "Everything's fine," he said, a little too quickly. "I'm just trying to adjust, that's all." I didn't believe him, but I decided to let it go for the time being. Pressing him would only make him retreat further, and I wasn't ready for another fight. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. A few days later, I came home from work early and found him on the phone in the kitchen. He didn't hear me come in, so I stood in the hallway, listening. "I told you, I don't have it," he was saying, his voice low and urgent. "I'm working on it. Just give me more time." There was a pause, and then he added, "No, I haven't told her anything. She doesn't know." My chest tightened as I realized he was talking about me. Before I could stop myself, I stepped into the room. "Who doesn't know what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He jumped, nearly dropping the phone. "Anna, I didn't hear you come in." "Clearly," I said, crossing my arms. "Who were you talking to?" "It's nothing," he said, quickly hanging up and shoving the phone into his pocket. "Just an old friend." "An old friend?" I repeated skeptically. "An old friend you're apparently hiding something from me for." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I demanded. He hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. Finally, he said, "I owe some people money. That's all." "Money?" I repeated, my stomach sinking. "What kind of people?" "It's not a big deal," he said quickly. "Just some personal loans I took out when things got tight. I'm working on paying them back." I didn't believe him for a second. "How much do you owe?" "It doesn't matter," he said, his tone defensive. "I'll take care of it. You don't need to worry about it." But I did worry. I couldn't help it. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I found myself pacing the living room, trying to piece together what little I knew. My father had always been good at avoiding responsibility. He'd abandoned our family, after all, but this felt different, desperate. The next day, while he was out for a walk, I went into his room. I told myself I was only looking for clues to help him, but deep down I knew I was crossing a line. I opened the drawer of his nightstand and found the stack of letters he'd been so protective of. The first one was from a collections agency, demanding payment for a delinquent credit card account. The second was a court notice, informing him that a lien had been placed on his bank account. The third was the most alarming, a letter from someone named Carl, written in messy, scrawled handwriting. "Edward," it began, "you're out of time. I've been patient, but I can't wait any longer. Pay up, or there will be consequences. Don't make me come find you." I stared at the letter, my hands shaking. Who was Carl? And what kind of consequences was he talking about? I put the letters back where I found them and tried to act normal when my father returned, but my mind was racing. That night, after he went to bed, I stayed up late, researching collections agencies and the kinds of debts that could lead to threats like the one in Carl's letter. What I found didn't ease my worries. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. He had come to me for help, claiming he had no one else, but he'd lied to me again. He hadn't just made bad financial decisions, he'd dragged me into a mess I didn't even know about. The next morning, I confronted him. I didn't bother easing into it. "Who's Carl?" I asked as he sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee. He froze, his hand hovering in midair. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," I said, pulling out the letter I had taken from his nightstand. "I found this. Care to explain?" His face paled, and for a moment I thought he might deny everything. But then he let out a heavy sigh and set down his mug. "Carl is someone I borrowed money from," he admitted. "What kind of someone?" I pressed. "A loan shark." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I sank into the chair across from him, my head spinning. "How much do you owe him?" "More than I can pay," he said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded. "Why did you come here, dragging all of this into my life, without being honest with me?" "I didn't want to worry you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, congratulations," I snapped. "I'm worried now." For the first time, he looked genuinely remorseful. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad," he said. "After Marjorie passed, I tried to keep everything together, but I made some bad decisions. I thought I could fix it on my own, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how selfish and reckless he had been. But looking at him, so small and defeated, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I stood up and walked away, leaving him alone in the kitchen. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the mess he had created. I knew I couldn't fix it for him, he didn't deserve that, and I didn't have the resources to do it, even if I wanted to. But I also couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: my father's return wasn't just about reconnecting with me. It was about survival, and whether I liked it or not, I was now a part of his mess. The days following my father's confession were a whirlwind of tension and uneasy silence. He kept to himself more than usual, as if retreating to the solitude of the guest room could shield him from the weight of his mistakes. Meanwhile, I found myself grappling with a growing sense of responsibility I didn't want but couldn't seem to escape. It wasn't just the threat of Carl that gnawed at me, it was the sheer depth of my father's fall. The man who had once seemed so confident, so in control, was now a shadow of himself. And yet, I couldn't ignore the anger simmering beneath my concern. His choices had brought him to this point, and now they were spilling over into my life. I spent hours online, researching everything I could about debt, loan sharks, and legal options. My professional skills as a project manager didn't exactly qualify me to deal with under-the-table lenders, but I was determined to find a way to protect myself while helping him navigate the mess he'd created. I wasn't doing it for him, I told myself that over and over. I was doing it for my own peace of mind. Finally, I decided I needed answers directly from the source. "Dad," I said one evening as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. "We need to talk." "About Carl." His fork froze mid-air, and he looked at me with a mixture of guilt and dread. "What about him?" "I need to understand exactly how deep you're in," I said firmly. "No more half-truths, no more excuses. If you want me to help, I need the whole story." For a moment he looked like he might argue. But then he set his fork down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right," he said quietly. "You deserve to know." And so he told me everything. After Marjorie's death, his finances had crumbled. Medical bills from her illness, combined with the cost of maintaining their home, had left him drowning in debt. He'd taken out multiple credit cards, maxing them out in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. When those weren't enough, he'd turned to Carl, a man he'd met through a mutual acquaintance, for a loan. At first it seemed manageable, he said, staring down at his plate. Carl gave me what I needed, and I made the payments on time. But then something would come up, another expense, another setback, and I'd have to borrow more. Before I knew it, the interest had ballooned to more than I could handle. "How much do you owe him now?" I asked, my voice tight. "50,000, he said, barely above a whisper. The number hit me like a punch to the gut. "50,000? I repeated, my mind racing. "How could you let it get this bad?" "I didn't mean for it to," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought I could fix it before it got out of control. But I was wrong." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I'd just heard. $50,000 wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a life-altering amount of money. And the fact that he'd gotten himself into this situation without ever reaching out for help until it was too late only fueled my frustration. "What happens if you don't pay him?" I asked, already dreading the answer. He hesitated, then said, "Carl's not the kind of person who takes unpaid debts lightly. He's already sent people to my house before. They didn't do anything, but it was a warning. If I don't pay him soon." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I didn't need him to. I knew exactly what he was implying. The confrontation. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without risk, but it was the best I could come up with under the circumstances. "Dad," I said, standing in the doorway of his room, "I'm going to call Carl." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. "No, Anna, absolutely not." "I don't see another option," I said firmly. "You're not going to be able to pay him back on your own, and ignoring him is only going to make things worse. If we don't address this head-on, it's only a matter of time before he shows up here." "But you don't understand what kind of man he is," he said, his voice shaking. "He's dangerous." "All the more reason to deal with this now," I said. "If we're upfront with him, maybe we can work out a payment plan or negotiate something reasonable. But we can't just sit here waiting for him to come after you or me." He looked like he wanted to argue, but eventually he nodded reluctantly. "Just be careful," he said. I found Carl's number in one of the letters and called him later that afternoon. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Who's this?" "This is Anna," I said, my voice steady. "Edward's daughter." There was a pause, and then he said, "Ah, Edward." I was wondering when I'd hear from him again. "What can I do for you, sweetheart?" The way he said sweetheart made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm calling to discuss his debt," I said. "We're trying to figure out a way to resolve this." Carl chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Well, isn't that nice of you?" But I'm afraid talking isn't going to cut it. Your old man owes me 50 grand and I intend to collect. I understand that, I said, choosing my words carefully, but 50,000 is a lot of money. There's no way he can pay that all at once. What if we worked out a payment plan? Another pause. You're serious about this, aren't you? Yes, I said. I just want to find a solution that works for everyone. Carl sighed. Fine. I'll give you 2 weeks to come up with 10 grand. If you can do that, we'll talk about the rest. But if I don't see that money in 2 weeks, all bets are off. 10,000 in 2 weeks? I said, my stomach sinking. That's impossible. Then I guess we're done here, he said, his tone icy. Good luck, sweetheart. He hung up before I could respond. The next 2 weeks were some of the most stressful of my life. I maxed out my own credit card, borrowed from friends, and even reached out to my mother for help. She wasn't happy about it, especially when I told her why, but she agreed to lend me what she could. In the end, we scraped together just enough to meet Carl's demand. I handed over the money in a tense, face-to-face meeting at a local diner, my hands trembling as I slid the envelope across the table. Carl smirked as he counted the bills, then looked up at me with a gleam in his eye. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said. Tell your dad he's lucky to have you. I didn't respond. I just stood up and walked out, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got home, I handed my father the empty envelope. It's done, I said. But this is the last time. You're on your own from now on. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, Anna. I'll never forget this. I wanted to believe him, but I knew better. Some people never change. In the months that followed, I set strict boundaries with my father. I helped him find a financial counselor and insisted he move out of my apartment once he was back on his feet. Our relationship would never be what it could have been, but I made peace with that. In the end, I realized that forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook, it's about letting go of the pain they've caused you. My father had hurt me in ways I couldn't fully articulate, but I wouldn't let his mistakes define me. And as I watched him leave my apartment for the last time, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I was free.